It's our final week and we have a quilted quilt top. We need to trim it down, which means we need to trim off the excess batting and backing after quilting. And I'm going to show you how to do that, and then we're going to bind our quilt. So we have a lot to do today. You want to lay your quilt out on your cutting mat. I have my 2 cutting mats underneath here. And I like to start on one side and preferably in a corner. Basically what we want to do is trim off our batting and our backing to the edge of the quilt. And we want to remember a couple things as we're trimming. One, we want to keep this as straight as possible. I am going to align my ruler directly on the edge of the quilt and cut up as far as I can reach. What will help you as you get moving is to trim the extra bit off somewhere around where the bottom edge of your quilt is, or this edge of your quilt is. That way you can kind of pull it away as you go. And then you want to keep the edge of your quilt as straight as possible so that you can align your ruler on the edge as straight as possible. Once I get enough cut that I can reach or that fits on my mat, I shift it down just kind of by gently pulling, keeping it straight and flat. So being your first quilt, it's possible that the edge of your quilt could be a little bit wavy, which is fine. What you typically want to do with that is make sure you're aligning your ruler as close to the edge as possible, but you might have to scoot it in on top of the quilt a little bit first. Once I scooted my quilt up, I aligned my ruler overlapping one of my cuts a little bit and then continued up the edge. And then I'm just going to shift down again. You're going to just continue shifting until you get one whole side trimmed off. If you get to a point where the side of your quilt, this is a good example right here. We have a decent kind of dip in from the edge. Sometimes that will happen on a quilt. And I can see at the top, maybe just it's skewed a bit, but the top square angles off into a different direction. So what you kind of want to look at if this happens, where this blue square is dipping in a bit. Now, you have to sew your binding on at 1/4 of an inch. So as long as you still have plenty of fabric to the outer edge of a 1/4 inch mark, you're fine to keep that aligned straight with the rest of your quilt. If you don't have enough fabric, you might have to end up trimming slightly more off of one side of your quilt. Typically, I don't recommend that because while we do have extra fabric on the edge of our quilt because of our seam allowance, once that seam allowance is covered with your binding at 1/4 inch, that will help all of these squares come down to the final square size. So if we trim off more than just to the edge, we will have blocks on the edge that are skewed a little bit. But sometimes you can't help it. As I get to the end here, I am aligning my ruler up and I can see that there's a little bit of a shift. You can see it with this edge here that it's at an angle now, but I don't want it to be at an angle. So I'm just going to kind of scoot it before I trim so it's more aligned, and that pulls out the edge of my quilt to be aligned. Sometimes when things are on a long arm for a long time, they can kind of settle into place, and sometimes that's not the place that we want them to go. When you get to a corner, you can continue going in the opposite direction. I like to at least start my cutting and using my ruler to align with a 90-degree angle if possible. Again, staying along the edge of my quilt top just to cut off the batting, and I'm gonna shift this down a bit because I am getting that skewed bit, and just get it started. And then I can kind of shift this way. Typically you want to cut along a side aligned with the longest part of your quilt top. And here I can see I am going to cut off a bit of these. You can shift that down again, just kind of aligning your seams and aligning the edge, just keeping everything square as possible. The only times it's not super visible to trim off edges without worrying about things aligning is when you have a wide single fabric border, and then you can kind of trim off without worrying about trimming any of the pattern off. But when you have a quilt that the pattern of the quilt is edge to edge like this, if you trim off too much of this edge, you're going to lose the scale of that edge pattern. So just some things to keep in mind. Again, you may in your first quilt have a little bit more that you need to trim off. And in the grand scheme of things, once your quilt is quilted and laundered and bound, you're going to notice those edges far less than right now when you're laying it out perfectly flat. So I'm going to flip this and rotate it all the way around. Let's not bump the camera. So I can go back to how I did the first side. And that was kind of trimming and then sliding it nicely down. One of the things when you are doing this and laying out your quilt to trim off these extra pieces is make sure nothing is folded under or bunched up somewhere where you're going to cut something you shouldn't. Okay, so here's another instance. We want to align this at a 90-degree angle, which we do have to shimmy a little bit. Oh, and see, that cleaned it up because one of these was coming in a little bit, but by doing a little bit of the pulling to make sure everything's aligned, we ended up taking away that little dip that was in there. Oops. So you're going to move around your whole quilt, all four sides, trimming off the excess batting and backing. You shouldn't have tons of batting and backing to trim off. This is probably the most you will have. And those pieces, the batting pieces, there's not much you can use for this. Some people use them for stuffing things like dog beds and stuff. But this is a great strip that you could save for binding or cut up into squares, but definitely still usable in my opinion. So I'm just going to finish trimming and we'll see if we come to any other little issues that we have to talk about as we do our final bit here and one last side. Okay, let's flip this around. Another way you can do this is if you have a hard space on your floor that you can lay everything out flat, you can actually have the whole quilt laid out flat and move your cutting board underneath the edge to trim everything off. So the quilt you're not moving, you're just moving your cutting board. I also have a good friend who uses a corner shaped level that shoots a laser. Not a real laser, but just a light laser out. and she aligns it with her corners after she lays her quilt flat onto the floor, and then she can trim her quilt perfectly straight, and it works really well for her. I do actually have one of those. I don't use it though, because I found sometimes you do have to cut off more of your pattern than you plan, and I do know she uses a lot of borders and stashing, so it works for her type of quilt a little bit better. Okay, here's a little something. I have a little bit of a fold over here because of some quilting. So what I want to do in this instance is keep my ruler aligned like I had it, and then align it over on this edge and just see what happens here. I'm going to trim it first, and then I do have a little bit of a dip in with the fabric, but I can tell that it's wrinkled up there, and this is just kind of a stitch I did at the end. So I'm going to unpick this bottom edge, and I think my fabric will just fall out. Okay, so I took out a few stitches, and so it is a little bit wavy, but it fills that space in a little bit better. And what I can do is I can use my ruler to kind of smooth it down and out. And there is a little bit of a divot in that square. So what I can do is just the tiniest bit, if I feel the need, I can kind of scoop my ruler up just a sliver and then have this ruler kind of angle back down. So I'm just cutting off the tiniest sliver of this quilt. See how little that is? Just to even that out so that there's plenty of fabric that will be in my seam allowance for my binding. And then when I'm sewing this with binding, I would just make sure I'm just doing a little bit of a stretch to smooth that fabric out so there's no bunching there. That's fine to do in that situation. So what we need to do next is make binding. So let's talk about that. For any quilt top, to figure out how much binding you need in inches, sometimes the patterns will tell you, not very often in my opinion. I don't tell people how many inches they'll need. But based on the size of the quilt, another instance, one of these super long measuring tapes can come in handy. You can also use the edge of your cutting mat and then just mark when you get to the end of your cutting mat and then measure from that mark on. What we're going to do though, just to verify, this should be 68 inches square, plus we have that extra 1/4 of an inch on all sides. So we're going to add 1/2 inch across and 1/2 inch up. So I'm guessing we're going to be at 68.5 or really close. But let's measure just to make sure. You're typically going to make your binding in increments of width of fabric. So you'll probably have plenty. But measuring two sides, 68.5. Look at that. So that's one side. And we know almost all the time the two sides of your quilt are the same size and the top and bottom of your quilt are the same size. There can be some discrepancy if you have to trim it down. So it can be best to measure, especially if you have very minimal fabric for binding. And you can see I'm just kind of holding my measuring tape in place as I move down. And then I get to the end. Oh, and see, it's a little bit bigger this way, which is really funny to me. It's 1.5 inches bigger in this direction. I don't know how that happens. So 70 inches. Okay, so here's what you're going to do. You're going to grab your phone with a calculator. You're going to take your top dimension and multiply it by 2. For me, that's 70 inches, so 140 inches. You're going to take your side dimensions and multiply that by 2. For me, that was 68 and a half, so that is 137. And then you're going to combine those two numbers, 140 plus 137 for this quilt. Yours is going to be different. Similar, but different. So we have 277 should be our total inches all the way around our quilt for our binding. We're going to scoot this up here. Now what we need to do is have our fabric for our binding and know how wide it is. Okay, I think we're going to use this fabric, this starry fabric, for a binding. And why we need to know how wide it is because we need to take our number. We had 70. 70 times 2 is 140. 68 and a half times 2 equals 137. And that means we have 277. We need to divide that by our width of fabric because that will tell us how many widths we're going to use. So you can use your cutting mat, and we want usable widths of fabric. And I'm just going to measure across. I have about 21 and a half. So that's 42 inches of usable space. So we need to divide 277, which is the amount of inches our quilt is around, by 42, and that will give us a little less than 6.6 is what it comes down to. You need to round that up. We're going to round that up to 7, so we need 7 widths of our fabric. That will help account for our seam allowance as well. So we need 7 widths of our binding fabric. Yours will probably be similar if you are using a similar width fabric. You're always going to end up with a little bit more binding. I've never had it come to a point where I've had exactly the right kind of binding. So what we want to do is cut our fabric into strips. Okay, so you're probably not going to have fabric off the bolt like this, but that's just what I happen to be playing with right now. What you are going to do to cut your fabric into strips is just like when we were cutting fabric before. You leave it coming off the bolt with that folded edge. You want to create that registration cut across the bottom that's at a 90-degree angle to your fold. And that is what gets us started. So I'm going to cut that now. Then binding is cut in 2.5-inch strips. So you're going to cut 2.5-inch strips, and you're going to cut as many strips as you calculated. I need 7. Yours is probably going to be around 7. I would say almost every quilt I make, which most of my quilts are in the 60 to 72-inch range, I need 6 to 7 strips of width of fabric to get my binding. I'm just going to kind of adjust this down here so it's a little bit easier to reach. So we're going to sew these binding strips together end to end after they're all cut. And you can do that 2 ways, one of 2 ways, I guess. I really like to sew my binding strips together with a straight seam, just top to bottom. A lot of people like to do a bias seam, which is an angled, and I'll show you both. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2 more, and we are good to go. And I keep a bin of leftover binding because sometimes I like to do a scrappy binding, or sometimes I have enough that I can bind the inside of a pouch or the edge of a pouch or something. So any excess binding will not go to waste. Okay, Now you have your 6 strips of fabric, or 7 strips of fabric, pardon me. What we need to do now is cut off the salvages. So the reason I didn't do that off the bolt, you can do that before you cut these, is because sometimes the salvages aren't lined up properly to help you save fabric. I like to realign them so that the edges I'm cutting off are aligned. So right now they're going to be wrong sides together, and I'm going to align the edge of this blue salvage with kind of the difference in fabric where it goes from the edge to the fabric on the back. I'm going to stack those right on top of each other. And I'll do that with each of the strips so I can trim them off all equally. And it's okay if you don't cut off everything exactly. Our main goal is to get most of it cut off and have just less than 1/4 of an inch left over, because that is our seam allowance. So there's 3 I stacked, and I would probably go and stack them all up. I'm still keeping my ruler aligned on the edge of the binding, even though these are stacked pretty straight. I would rather have my binding dictate how straight the edges are than my cutting mat and it be off. Okay, we have all 6 of our strips ready to go. They all have even edges, which is great. So if you are going to sew without a bias edge, it is very simple. You can go straight to your machine. You can take your fabrics. Now remember, if you have directional binding fabric, you want to place them kind of end to end with the direction of your fabric going the same way. And you're going to sew those 2 ends together by flipping them right sides together. And you're going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance right down the edge here, and I would back stitch at the bottom and top. If we are going to do a biased edge, the reason people do a bias edge is it does offer a tiny bit of stretch, but it gives you a longer seam, which gives you I guess people say it's stronger, that diagonal seam, because it's longer and it goes across more of the fabric, makes that binding stronger. So basically you're going to sew it together at a 45-degree angle, and I'm going to angle this just to show you, but I'll tell you actually how to sew. So this is how it's sewn together, like that. And in order to achieve that, what you need to do is have one fabric right side up coming out to the side, the other fabric right side down going down and aligning those points right here. Then you are actually going to mark a line from the bottom point of this one underneath. I like to remark that so I know where the point is on top. I'm going to, with that point meeting up to the top point on the diagonal, I am going to sew a seam right on top of my marked line and trim off this, and then I'll open it up and reveal that. So that's a bias seam for your binding, and it does produce a longer seam than just sewing 2 pieces together. See, and it creates, once we fold the binding in half, just creates more surface space across the binding that is where it's seamed together. Let's go to the machine, and then we can see how to sew both of these on the machine. Okay, so we are here at the machine. I have 2 pieces that are placed right sides together, end to end, and I'm just going to do a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance straight down the sides, back stitching at the top and bottom. and you want to use around a 2 or 2.2 stitch length. And then when we go to iron this seam, we're going to actually press the seam open. That will give us the least amount of bulk in our binding. So there is a straight seam binding. This is what I use personally 99% of the time. And I've had absolutely no problems with it. If you would like to do the biased seam, you remember we want, okay, I'm just trying to find the right pieces of where I marked. We want to have our fabric right side up, going horizontal, and then our next fabric right side down, facing like vertically, I guess, aligning those top corners. And we have our marked line from the bottom corner of the piece behind to the top corner at the angle, just like how it's aligned here is what you would have to do for a bias binding. And you're going to sew right on top of that marked line. My marked line is not perfect, so I'm not going to sew right on top of it in the beginning, but I'm going to end up on top of it at the end. You notice I didn't really do a back stitch on this one. I feel like you could and you couldn't. So we have our seam there. You're going to trim off the corner with a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. You can do it with scissors. You can be very accurate. If you happen to be able to see through your fabric at all, you want that to be super accurate. Still, we're going to press our seams open, but that is what our bias seam looks like. So the next step for binding after you have all your pieces sewn together is you fold it in half and iron it. And so I'm going to just show you right here. You can see that seam just spans more surface area from where my thumbs are is where it's going. And so it might be a little bit stronger in that case because that's what it is. And then you'll actually see only about this much of the seam, like a 1/4 inch on the front and a 1/4 inch on the back. So I'm going to sew the rest of my strips together. I'm just going to do them straight. The one thing is, especially if you're using a solid fabric, make sure you're getting your fabrics right sides together. Solids typically don't have a right or a wrong, but some can, and sometimes it can be hard to tell. And then just make sure you're always grabbing from one pile and adding to the next because you don't want to sew all of your strips into a big giant loop. Now remember, when we are binding our quilt, when we get to the edge of the binding that we've sewn onto the quilt, we do have to join the last bits of binding together on top of our quilt. And I'll walk you through that whole process, but that can be a little bit more cumbersome if you're doing the bias seams as well. I believe the bias seams, the angled seams, are the most traditional seams for sewing binding together, but like I said, I've never had a problem with straight seams. So we're going to go to the ironing board and iron everything. So I have my long strip falling off the edge of the ironing board here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start at one end of my binding. I am going to fold my binding in half, aligning the edges, the raw edges, right on top of each other. And I'm going to start ironing it flat. It doesn't take much, and once you get going with the iron, you can really just kind of align it and continue down with your iron, only pausing when you need to shift your fabric up the ironing board. So like that. Then I just kind of pull down, and I'm going to continue. When I come to a seam, I am just going to open my seam up first and iron that seam flat. But then I'm going to go back to where I left off, ironing my binding in half. And I'm just going to continue ironing, aligning those raw edges and getting a nice crisp fold. You're going to do this for the whole length of your binding. And it goes pretty quick, in my opinion. And if you would prefer to finger press a little bit before you pull the iron, you can do that to kind of hold the fabric in place so that it is a little bit easier to make that crease happen by just gliding the iron over. This is the bias one that we have here, and you can see I did not do anything different in ironing, pressing it open and just continuing along the route. So once you have all of your binding ironed, you can just kind of roll it up. If you have a binding spool, Stitch Supply makes some cute ones, you can use that. All of mine are in use, but I just kind of roll it around my hand, making sure it stays kind of in the orientation, like the fold stays nicely smooth. So as you roll it, you'll probably have to, you know, unwind some of the twists, but that just kind of helps it stay all together. If you're going to put it right on, you don't have to even wind it. You could just leave a tail and bring it over to the machine.